now have another great panel who are going to bring to our discussion really rich experiences and expertise to the theme for this part of the seminar, which is Space War, Overview and New Developments. And our panelists for this afternoon, I'll introduce them. First of all, it's Peter Burt. We've heard Peter's voice there just in that video, and it was great that he played such an active part in developing that. We probably all know of Peter's work within drone wars and the work that he's been developing on artificial intelligence and autonomy and their role in the future development of drones. He's also very involved deeply in the new Space Watch program. And before that, he had a great deal of experience working for the Nuclear Information Service, where he worked for 6 years, undertaking research into the costs and risks of nuclear developments and nuclear weapons, and of course has been able to bring that experience to drone wars. Then I think we've got Jill. I can see Jill up there now as well, Dr. Jill Stuart. Jill is based at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and her expertise is in politics and ethics in the law of outer space, its exploration and exploitation. And as you can imagine, because of that experience, she is really a go-to person for the media when it comes to these issues being raised and discussed. And obviously, she's regularly invited to be an international panelist because of her experience. Dave Webb, who's up there as well, hello Dave, is another member of the steering committee of drone wars. Dave also comes from an academic background, having worked at the Leeds Beckett University, where he's now Emeritus Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies. But as we heard with Penny, he also brings a great deal of grassroots and community peace-based work to his work with drone wars. Some of the organizations he's been associated with are the Global Network Against Weapons, Scientists for Global Responsibility, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and he's now giving a lot of his time and expertise and writing skills to Space Watch UK. And then we have Roy Jones, and I can see Roy there as well. Another, I hate that term, veteran peace campaigner, let's say experienced peace campaigner, and founder of Parc against Darc, which is a campaign based in Pembrokeshire, which is opposing some of the deep space radar projects that are being developed there. A long-time campaigner, he had great success in the 90s with the campaign to resist similar initiatives and campaigns in the Pembrokeshire area. And being a local activist, he also brings his expertise into the national arena too. So we have 4 great panelists. The pattern we're going to follow is we're going to have, first of all, we'll hear from Peter and Jill, giving them each about 10 minutes. And then we'll give time to raise questions or comments about their inputs so that we do justice to their time. And then we'll hear from Dave and from Roy, again, equal time, and discussion and questions around their input. And that should take us to about 3 o'clock or thereabouts. But I think we've got good time, so I think we'll do well. So, Peter, can we ask you to kind of kick off this afternoon sessions on space war and overviews and new developments?
Thank you very much, Pat. I have a few slides to show, so let me see whether I can get them up. So you should be able to see the first page of the presentation now. Is that right, Pat?
I can see a white screen with a black square in it, black rectangle in it.
No, that's not what we want. Let's try again.
Maybe that's me. Maybe everyone else is seeing.
No, that's what I can see as well. So something's definitely wrong.
Just think among yourselves as we're waiting for this.
Oh no.
Very frustrating, isn't it, when things don't quite go right? But
Okay.
we've all been there, Peter, so don't worry. There we are.
Is that any better?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Good, good. Okay. Right. So I've been asked to talk about the UK's military space programme. So what we're going to talk about in the presentation is...
Oh, we lost you.
Right. Is that any better?
We've lost it now.
Oh dear.
You probably clicked the wrong button.
No, I didn't. I've got a message saying screen sharing has failed to start.
Oh,
Sorry
your
about that.
bandwidth is low, it's telling me.
Yeah, it's telling me that as well.
Oh dear. Is it something that either Chris or Cora could share on your behalf?
Yeah, Peter, do you want to send it to me by email and I can try and open it on my computer? And you can just ask me to move the slides along.
Let me just see whether I can try that again first. Sorry.
If it helps, I don't mind going first.
We could
Just a
stop.
thought.
Is
Yeah,
that all right?
I think that might be better. Yeah. Could
Yeah,
you
we'll stop
excuse me
for
a moment
now
or two
and-
while we try and do that? Yeah, my
Yes.
apologies about that.
Thank you very much, Jill, for kind of being so flexible. That's great.
Absolutely. I have to say, many years ago, I had a workshop at the LSE with one of the most experienced astronauts in the world, the person who was head of space exploration at the European Space Agency, and none of our computers worked. And I was so embarrassed, but it happens. It absolutely happens. Let me see. Well, let's see if I can share mine. Let's see here. Is that, oh wait, here we go. Is that showing?
It's coming. Yes, there we are.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks very much for having me. I love doing events with this organization, and I've known Dave for a long time and always appreciate getting invited to these sorts of things. The video that was played just before was excellent, I have to say, and so I hope that what I'm adding isn't too redundant, because it covered really good information, a lot of which I'm going to, well, I guess we can say I'm reiterating it. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about, I don't know why this isn't advancing. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about space law and the history of it. I want to talk about the history of it because I think it's helpful to know the context in which these laws were developed, so that we can kind of appreciate the background regime as it's formulated over the years to give us where we're at today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at with it today. As was mentioned in the video, it's very much a product. The background outer space legal infrastructure consists of 5 main treaties, and they were very much created in the setting, the context of the 1960s and the 1970s. So very much the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the things that I think is interesting within this is, as both of these countries were getting to the point where they thought they were going to be able to access outer space, why create a legal governance infrastructure for it? And in some ways it can be seen as kind of nice, and a lot of the language used in these treaties is kind of noble and about cooperation. But in reality, a lot of it was actually to do with the fact that they both wanted to lock the other one into a certain set of agreements because they felt that they would be unable to control outer space themselves. So this is an image of Starfish Prime, which was one of the early nuclear weapons tests that was done by the United States in kind of the border of high Earth atmosphere and low outer space. But both the United States and the Soviet Union were practicing with nuclear weapons there on the boundary between space. And so it kind of was accepted that these two powers both wanted to go to the United Nations to try and establish a governance infrastructure. And they started thinking about 2 potential models to design space law for. The first was the high seas analogy. So the high seas have been accepted as being neutral territory since the 1500s, really. They were a really long-standing international legal regime. And so according to this analogy, outer space would be neutral territory and objects could pass freely beyond it. So at some point, airspace would end and outer space would begin, and it would be neutral territory. And the other possibility was to establish an airspace analogy. So air law was also developing around this time with the growth of commercial flights and so on. And according to this, a country's territory extends above it. So there are agreements that allow for the passage of airplanes between countries, but countries maintain ownership and governance over the space above them. So according to this analogy, outer space would extend beyond a country's territory. So countries would still have control over the segment of outer space that was above them. What I think is interesting is that there was a different perspective between the two main superpowers on these positions at the time. The United States preferred the high seas analogy, and the Soviet Union preferred the airspace analogy. A lot of people would assume that this might be because the Soviet Union was much larger. So the airspace analogy would give them a really big chunk of ownership of outer space. But in actuality, the main reason behind this was reconnaissance. So again, even though these treaties have very nice language, even in the very beginnings, it was largely about militarization, military activities. So essentially, because the United States was a more open society and had a more open media, they had a stronger interest in being able to spy on the Soviet Union from space. They ended up agreeing on the high seas analogy, which is why we have outer space as neutral territory. And that was largely because the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which passed over all different countries around the world. So it established the norm of what we call overflight. And also the Soviet Union's relationship with China deteriorated around this time. China was also a very closed society. And so suddenly the Soviet Union also had a really strong interest in being able to use outer space for reconnaissance purposes. So their interest shifted, and we agreed with the high seas analogy, making outer space neutral territory. And this was embodied in a couple of key treaties. One of the first ones that preceded the Outer Space Treaty was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Again, I think just with a recognition of the escalation of the threat from nuclear weapons, it was agreed that it was in the strategic interests of the United States and the Soviet Union to agree to this test ban treaty. And then the other is the Outer Space Treaty, which was mentioned in the video a moment ago. And it says some interesting things, that space is intended to be for peaceful purposes and the benefit of all humankind. Also that you can't make sovereign claims. So this is where we get the idea that outer space is neutral territory. No country can claim ownership over any part of outer space. It also says that there can be no weapons of mass destruction in space, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, and also that there can be no military bases or weapons testing on celestial bodies. I recognize that there are challenges with this. I just want to say from the video, the one thing I would maybe disagree with is this idea that the Outer Space Treaty is sort of not fit for purpose now. I agree that it needs to be overlaid with additional agreements and mechanisms of governance, but I think that it does still form a good basis on which to build upon. But there are challenges. So going back to this idea of weapons of mass destruction, it only bans weapons of mass destruction. It doesn't ban other weapons. And one of the main areas that we've seen testing done on this is with anti-satellite weapons. So firing something from Earth into outer space to destroy a satellite. There are countries that have been practicing with this. India, China, Russia, and the United States have all conducted anti-satellite weapons tests. They've all conducted them on their own satellites. And sometimes they'll justify it by saying, well, the satellite was defunct and maybe even errant and was going to go off course. So it was in our collective interest for us to destroy it. But I think that's largely a narrative to justify practicing with these weapons because of the debris cloud that they create and the risk from the Kessler syndrome, which was mentioned in the video as well. So, but I'm going to come back to anti-satellite weapons testing in a minute. And then the other thing, again, mentioned in the video, is this issue of dual use technology. So much of the technology that's in space, if not all of the technology in space, could be used for either military or civilian purposes. So in the same way that a remote sensing satellite can help us observe the Earth's surface to monitor environmental issues and climate change, or even things like migration patterns for humans, or There have been cases of monitoring genocide from space, but that same camera can be used for spying and military purposes. Global positioning, largely used as a force multiplier in theaters of war. Global communications networks, very much a force multiplier for military activity, but also equally usable for civilian purposes. So it makes it really difficult to monitor and enforce regulations on military activity in space, and also gives states an opportunity to manipulate and be less transparent about their intentions for the technology that they have up there. And the last one that I wanted to highlight was this idea of militarization versus weaponization. So space has been, we can't use weapons of mass destruction there, but related to the dual use technology issue, it is very clearly used in military, and it has been militarized in many ways. So the treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, doesn't ban the use of space for surveillance, reconnaissance, global positioning, communication. Those are all allowed. Again, partly because it's impossible to monitor whether or not that technology is being used for civilian or military purposes. It really complicates things. Some more recent developments. So one that I wanted to highlight was the Artemis Accords, which were drafted in, that should say 2020, by the United States. And these relate specifically to the moon. And I'm generally not, even though I have an American accent, I am not generally a favor of the US. But I have to say there are some nice things about these accords. They highlight issues around transparency and using the lunar surface for scientific purposes, and kind of build upon the language of the Outer Space Treaty of saying that space should be used for peaceful purposes. However, I absolutely recognize that the Artemis Accords are very much US-led, and sort of are seen as potentially giving the US a first mover advantage in terms of establishing more regulation for the lunar surface. And there are other countries that are not comfortable with that, and I completely understand why. They're also non-binding, so it's an agreement that countries have been asked to sign up for. But as with so much of international law, there's not a lot of strong enforcement mechanisms within it, and so some of the key players in space, like China, have not signed up to the Artemis Accords. But there are currently 53 countries that are signed up to them. And the other thing I wanted to do is come back to the issue of anti-satellites. So I've been researching this area for 25 years now. And one of the biggest areas I think I've seen sort of normative movement on is with regards to anti-satellite weapons. It's really seen as taboo now. I know that international law doesn't have obvious enforcement mechanisms like a world police. But in my research, I have found that a lot of countries do want to continue to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the international community. So they will try to justify their actions in a way that keeps them from being scrutinized by the international community. And so every time there have been anti-satellite weapons tests in recent times, there's been a real outcry within the international community. And yeah, we're seeing some movement, I think, towards potentially getting a ban on their usage. Some people would say that this is partly because countries are realizing that anti-satellite weapons aren't as useful as they thought they might be. So they can, get the benefits of demonstrating leadership and cooperative behavior by agreeing to a ban on anti-satellite weapons, even though it's not going to affect them directly all that much. That's sort of the cynical view of it. But regardless, I think it would be a good thing if we get some movement on that. And the United Nations has proposed such a ban, but these things take time. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops in the coming years. Yeah, that was all I had on my bit.
Thank you very much, first of all, for standing in, and also for that presentation, taking us through the kind of evolution of space law, and also highlighting the opportunities and limitations that are there, which are all very important for campaigners and researchers. So thank you very much for that. And we'll come back with some questions. Peter, are you sorted now?
I think we are, Pat. So let's have a go and see what happens.
That's
If
great.
the worst comes to the worst, then I can just talk through it, but we'll see what happens.
We're going to try and screen share from mine.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed,
Just one second.
Gil, for stepping in. And Cora, yeah, if you try screen sharing it, we'll see what happens.
Got it?
That's the one. So I can see
Amazing.
that, and hopefully everybody else can. So let's move on to the first slide, please, Cora. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the UK's military space programme. So we can talk firstly, just a reminder why space is important. Then we can have an overview of the UK's military space programme, and we can look in a little bit more detail about space partnerships with the US and others. And we can also look at spaceports and plans for launching satellites into space from the UK. So let's move on to the next slide, please. You've probably seen a picture like this somewhere before. It sort of sets out some various uses of space in modern society. So as you can see, there are a number of them. The most important basically are for communications, telecommunications, and for sort of, if you like, Earth observation, surveillance and watching what's going on down here, and for what we call positioning, navigation and timing. So using sort of satellites to direct things and systems like GPS, which help us geolocate and find out where we are. So if we move on. Yeah. While we can use all of those things in civil society, those things are also essential to modern warfare. And here's a quote from the Ministry of Defence, sort of underlying this. Space is basically fundamental to military operations and underpins our ability to undertake the majority of defence tasks. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about this. And what we see is that a lot of space technologies and systems are dual use. So that means that they can be used for both civil and military use. So for example, a civil communications satellite, like one run by Intelsat, for example, or Viacom, they will be carrying television signals and internet signals and satellite communication signals, not only for broadcasting companies, but also for the military. And it's really, really hard to sort of untangle the two. If a rocket puts payloads up into launch, the odds are it will be carrying both military and civil satellites. And in the UK, we know that the UK Space Agency works very closely with the Ministry of Defence, regular communication and contact between the two. And people in the UK military have emphasised that. There's a quote there from Air Commodore Fluin, formerly from UK Space Command, pointing out that one of the key points for the Ministry of Defence is that in the UK, defence and civil space are not separable. They very much work hand in glove. So moving on to the next slide. Let's look a little bit more in depth at what the UK military has in terms of its sort of policies and frameworks available for what's going on in space. Things really sort of got off to a proper start in April 2021 when the UK Space Command was set up. And then a little bit more than a year later, the Ministry of Defence published its space strategy, talking about, quote, how defence will protect the UK's national interests in space in an era of ever-growing threats. So let's see what is actually in the defence space strategy. First off, there was a funding commitment for spending over a 10-year period of a little bit more than £6 billion, which in military terms is not a lot of money. The UK is not a kind of major space power by any stretch of the imagination. What it's going to be spent on is a number of things. The UK has a satellite communication systems called Skynet that's used for secure military and government communications. So that's going to be, if you like, given a wash and brush up. It's going to have a new operating framework, and there's going to be a new satellite added to the Skynet satellite network. There's also going to be money allocated to developing space domain awareness capabilities. Space domain awareness is basically tracking objects in orbit, like other satellites or asteroids or space debris. And money will be spent at Fylingdales, and there'll be cooperation with the US on the Darc radar system to enable that. And I think Dave and Roy will be talking a little bit more in detail about that later on. So on the next slide, we can see that one of the other things that the Ministry of Defence is keen to spend money on, one of their priorities is a new network of small satellites for information gathering and surveillance and reconnaissance. And that satellite network is known by the acronym ISTARI. The first of those satellites was launched last summer in a launch from the United States by SpaceX. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Ministry of Defence announced they awarded a contract to Airbus for the design and launch of the next satellite, which they hope will go into orbit in 2027. So if we move on, obviously, we can see from some of those things that the UK has very close links to the US military space programme. Just looking here in the UK, then the US has ground control stations and intelligence processing bases here in the UK. So, for example, the Feltwell American satellite communications base in East Anglia is used for controlling satellites. Wenwith Hill Spy Base, which most of you I'm sure know about in Yorkshire, handles signals intelligence gathered from space and from satellites. And, for example, information on tracking space objects from Fylingdales, that's also shared with the US. Let's see what the next slide says. Thank you. The UK and the US are also very closely intertwined in the way in which they operate together on space issues. And I see we have a question about that in the question list. The UK was the first member which the US allowed to enter its new Olympic Defender Coalition, which is a group of its allies intended to deter adversaries and hostile acts in space. That's another way of saying control space for the military. And the US and the UK cooperate very closely in terms of space systems. So they are aiming to make their satellites interoperable. That means that US and UK traffic can both be handled on US and UK satellites. They will participate together in different war games, in exercises on space warfare, and they also share information, as we mentioned, particularly on space domain awareness. And the UK has a number of secondments to the US Space Force as well to sort of help with that interlinking and interoperability. Finally, let's just say a few words about spaceports. Spaceports are basically sites where satellites are launched from, where rockets take off from. And there are 7 spaceports on paper at various stages of development in the United Kingdom, mainly at sites in the north and northwest of Scotland. And there are plans to launch from one of those spaceports, Saxavord, in the far north of the Shetland Islands, in this summer. That would be the first successful launch of a satellite from the UK if it goes ahead as planned. However, looking at what's happening at spaceports, we see that the economic cases for these ventures are very marginal, and spaceports are basically likely to require government, which means military, custom to succeed. So I was looking at a news article today about the Saxe-Ford spaceport, again saying that its operators don't expect it to start making profit for a couple of years yet, and they are needing still to look around for loans to finance the operation over that period before it becomes viable. Again, to emphasise the military function of spaceports, the UK a few months ago signed a letter of intent with within the NATO context, specifically allowing NATO members to use UK launch vehicles and UK spaceports when they become operational. Let's see the next slide. Thank you. Yes, and here's a quote from somebody who has far more military establishment credentials than I do when it comes to spaceport issues. Alexandra Stickings, who's an analyst at the military think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. And Alexandra has pointed out that the proposed spaceports would need the MOD as a customer to survive, as well as securing contracts with companies such as Lockheed Martin, obviously big military organisations. There is also a possibility that if these sites become a reality, there will be pressure on the MOD to support them, even if the cost is more than other providers. So to conclude very briefly, what we're saying here, if we look at the final slide, is that UK space policy is, as far as the MOD is concerned, geared around war fighting. And we have a quote there from a minister in the previous Conservative government about space policy. And I think the policy has not changed at all under the new government. The fact is that competition in space is fierce, and the challenge of protecting our orbiting systems needs strategic thinking to reduce threat impact. That's why we and our close allies have determined it to be a war-fighting domain. So thank you very much, everybody. Open for questions in a moment. If we just move on to the next slide, then there's a little bit of information about Spacewatch UK. Do please check out the website and the social media to find out.
Thank you, Peter. Ending on a rather chilling phrase there, a war-fighting domain. Give us a lot of food for thought. We've got time for questions now. There are two already that have been posted, one from James Chan and one from Tom Cuthbert. So James, if you're there, would you like to articulate your question? It would be nice to hear some other voices. Are you there, James? Right, well, we'll go to Tom's if Tom's still there, and then we'll come back to James. Tom, are you still there?
You can hear me now. I've just unmuted.
Thank you.
Okay, this came up with CAD's campaigns group about a week ago of the idea of an Iron Dome predicted for the UK. That sounds kind of protective, i.e. to protect us from presumed rocket attacks. Massive expense. I'd be happy if rocket attacks didn't happen at all. But how does technology in space relate to iron domes, for example? Does it? Or can it even be used?
Jill, have you got a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the Iron Dome thing is interesting. My sense is that it's not going to happen, partly just because of the sheer size of the UK. I mean, I think the model for this is very much Israel, which is a much smaller country. And so the expense and the practicalities of establishing one for the UK, although it's been mooted, I can't see how that would potentially come into effect. But yeah, I'm not entirely clear on the mechanisms of how they work, but clearly they are legal because Israel operates one as well. So I'm trying to think, I'm not sure. Oh, I believe that a lot of the monitoring for it is from space. So although it's a localized, the dome itself is localized within Earth's atmosphere, so would fall under the category of domestic law, or sovereign law. The monitoring for it, I believe the early detection systems in place are very much from space, but considered legal and already very much used.
Thank you.
I don't know if Peter knows more about the technical side of that.
I can say a few words. Thank you, Jill. This basically goes back. I'm sure our older listeners will remember President Reagan's Star Wars initiative back in the 1980s, and the idea was that there would be what Reagan called space shield. So there would be all kinds of clever orbiting satellites and ground-based systems that would be able to sort of shoot down missiles before they ever got anywhere near the United States. And even at the time, this technology was criticised as being effectively non-existent. It was far ahead of the technical capabilities at the time, and also had a massive cost as well. And that hasn't really changed very much, despite the fact that quite a lot of research has gone into ballistic missile defence type systems in the meantime. President Trump has talked about some kind of Iron Dome for the United States. It's not 100% clear what he means. The makers of Israel's Iron Dome system have said that, you know, their system wouldn't work on the States. It's not that kind of system. And likewise, I think the United Kingdom is not going to be in a position to spend vast sums of money on research and development for such systems. Basically, there's a fundamental problem with such missile defence systems, indeed all missile defence systems. It's much easier for somebody who wants to attack you with ballistic missiles to overcome the missile defence system than it is for you to bolster up the system so that it's effective. The reason for that is because it's much easier and cheaper to just overwhelm the defences with even more missiles than it is to put expensive defensive systems in place. The economics are very much in favour of the aggressor in this. And this has been, you know, known since the 1960s, when there were concerns in the US and the UK about anti-ballistic missile systems that the Soviet Union then was putting into place. So I think anything that people say about sort of putting ballistic missile defences into space, which are going to be effective, needs to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Thank you both. James, I gather it's fine for me to read out your question. So here we go. Paul Godfrey, previously head of UK Space Command, was promoted to the Air Marshal. That's the second highest rank in the Air Force. He was then appointed as Assistant Chief of Space Operations in the US Space Force at the Pentagon. As space militarization intensifies, how might this heighten the risk of the UK being pushed into a US-led space conflict? I'm sure you've both got something to say on that. Jill, do you want to go first?
Yeah, actually, I think I will largely defer to Peter on this. It's something that I didn't know. I didn't know that that was the case. And it's interesting that it's not a secondment, but an actual appointment. I mean, my hunch is that these connections have already been in place. And so, you know, the hiring of one person is not necessarily, I don't know, I suppose it might contribute to the momentum, but the momentum's already there. But I would defer to Peter on that.
Yeah, thanks again, Jill. I think I agree with you on that. I think the point is, it doesn't really just hinge around one individual. As we saw in the presentation, there are lots of connections between the UK Space Force and the US Space Force, and it's been set up that way. It's been set up so that they're designed to be interoperable. They exercise together in war games, and the whole concept of things like the Olympic Defender Network, and indeed NATO as a whole, means that the US can and will involve all of its allies in, any military action that it intends to take in this respect. So, at the end of the day, all of the kind of technology, all of the military infrastructure is in place to allow that cooperation to take place. Whether it takes place, of course, is a political decision based on what the government of the day decides. So I think we all know what that would be.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thanks. Well, I think we're still within very good time, so I'm going to move us now to the second part of this, where we're going to hear from Dave and from Roy. And I think we'll be hearing a little bit more about some of the on-the-ground impact that these developments are having for communities and for campaigning. So, Dave, can I turn to you first? Thanks.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks to all the speakers so far. I'm going to come over, go over some of the things that have already been said again, but I'll just try and set my screen up. Can you see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good. So I'm going to focus actually on campaigning against US Star Wars in Yorkshire, because I know a little bit about that, and it's where I live, so it's of great importance to me. But it also is is an example of how things have developed over the years, because actually the US and UK role in space warfare has been going on for a very long time. It's not new. But let's start with, sorry, finding buttons, here we go. Let's start with, come on, change slide, there we go. So there are a lot of space bases or places in England and Wales. We've already mentioned Scotland, Peter mentioned Scotland. In England and Wales, there are a number of places around the countries which are involved in space business, much of it military. I'm not going to talk about all of them. We will be talking about the one in Wales, in Brawdy, or one of the ones in Wales later on. Roy will be talking about that. I'm just going to focus on these two. It's already been mentioned, both of them. Fylingdales in North Yorkshire and Menwith Hill in North Yorkshire. So a bit of history, first of all, and some of this has already been mentioned. But in 1983, Ronald Reagan launched the idea of a national missile defense system to protect the continental US from all missile attacks. And this was his Strategic Defense Initiative, which also became more widely known as Star Wars because of the range of space systems that were envisioned by it, including the idea of a space force. And US Space Command was established in 1985, and its vision for 2020, published in 1987, outlined its goal of full spectrum dominance. Sorry, okay. Full spectrum dominance on land, at sea, in the air, space, and of information. In 2002, its functions were moved to US Strategic Command, and then it was re-established in 2019, along with the US Space Development Agency. And these have continued to develop some of the elements of SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative, including the tracking and targeting of space objects. In December of the same year, 1997, in December of the same year, Donald Trump authorized Space Force as the world's newest warfighting domain. There is going to be a lot of things happening in space because space is the world's newest warfighting domain, he said. And Secretary of Defense Mark Esper at the time said, maintaining American dominance in that domain is now the mission of the United States Space Force. In 2020, Space Force announced a new command structure consisting of 3 commands: Space Operations Command, Space Systems Command, and Space Training and Readiness Command, under which there are units called deltas and garrisons. The deltas are responsible for specific operations, and garrisons are responsible for providing support to deltas. And this all fits into the US space warfighting architecture as shown here. First 9 deltas are assigned to Space Operations Command with tasks as shown here. The 2 Buckley and Peterson-Schriever garrisons are also shown. The aim of dominating and controlling space requires an ability to monitor everything that goes on there. And this is known as space domain awareness, as Peter has already mentioned, and that's the role of Space Delta 2. Space dominance awareness, space domain, awareness, is the detection, tracking, characterization, and understanding of all activity within the space domain, not to be confused with space situational awareness, which is focused on enabling decision-making for operations of a single or small group of space objects in the space domain. So basically, space domain awareness is about monitoring all activity, whether it be the satellites of other nations or space debris. This sounds like it may be okay until you link it with other roles of space battle management. It will be another tool that the US Space Force has for planning and executing a war in outer space. Data is collected from a variety of space sensors and ground-based telescopes and radars, which is combined with intelligence sources to produce a picture of the space environment. It enables the military to monitor the activities of others in space and can provide data for the targeting of anti-satellite systems. And this is where the UK comes in. Fylingdales in the North Yorkshire Moors National Park is part of this surveillance network, as is Thule in Greenland. Fylingdales is run for the US by the RAF and has been the home of US ballistic missile early warning system since the Cold War days of the 1950s. It originally consisted of 3 white spherical radomes, 43 meters in diameter. Each radome housed and protected a large radar dish that could be mechanically steered to search for intercontinental ballistic missiles that threatened the USA from the Soviet Union over the pole. In 1992, these were replaced by a 40-meter high large phased array radar. Each of the 3 faces of this truncated pyramid contains an array of 2,560 aerials, transmitting with a total mean power of about 2.5 megawatts and a 360-degree coverage. It can detect drinks can-sized objects at a range of about 5,000 kilometers into space. An upgrade of this system was required in 2007 to enable it to perform a tracking and targeting role as part of the US National Missile Defense System. The base is one of 3 stations in a chain linked across the North Atlantic. The other stations are Clear in Alaska and the Thule Air Base, now known as Pituffik Space Base in Greenland. Together, these form part of the US Continental Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. The ballistic missile warning role comes under Space Delta 4, meaning that Fylingdales is part of these 2 units, surveillance and early warning. The PR for Fylingdales often focuses on its role in tracking debris and warning the International Space Station of possible collisions. However, there's much more to it than that, and space domain awareness and missile targeting abilities are important for control and domination of the region. There has been a campaign against the role of Fylingdales, which acts as part of the US military war machine, since the 1960s. It's rather remote and difficult to get to by public transport, but its Star Wars role intensified interest in the base and the protest against it. In 2000, the US was about to withdraw from the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, to establish its national missile defense system. Fylingdales would be part of that, and CND organised a national demonstration there called Point the Finger at Fylingdales to emphasise its role. Another national demonstration in 2002 linked the base with US Star Wars programmes. The UK government had promised a full public and parliamentary discussion on the use of Fylingdales for US missile defence. But despite a large number of protests submitted to the House of Commons Defence Committee, it was announced in January 2003 that it would be allowed to take part. So in 2003, Yorkshire CND organised a No Star Wars tour from Faslane to London via Fylingdales and Menwith Hill, also taking in Feltwell in East Anglia and Croughton in Northamptonshire, two other US bases with space connections. This would link the nuclear submarine base in Scotland to the MOD in London via the US bases involved in Star Wars. You can see here one of the walkers was Bruce Kent. In its submission to the House of Commons Defence Committee, Yorkshire CND had expressed concerns about the health effects of the electromagnetic radiation from the radar. In response, the MOD published for the first time results of electromagnetic radiation levels measured around the base from 1991. There was some media coverage about the radiation levels, which appeared to be within UK limits, but were very close to the tighter European Union limits. In 2007, the UK agreed to a US request to use Fylingdales radar for missile defence, which required another upgrade to enable the radar to more accurately target incoming missiles and other space objects. The following year, the Keep Space for Peace Week demonstration featured Yanya Gilivichka from the Ney Zakladam, which was NATO bases in the Czech Republic. This campaign had led to a highly successful campaign to stop a very high-powered radar for US missile defence being stationed in the Czech Republic. Around this time, the UK base commander would sometimes meet with demonstrators and accept a written statement. In 2012, Yorkshire CND organised a 3-day Recycle the Bases Fylingdales to Menwith Hill bike ride, stopping at Pickering and Harrogate to demonstrate with banners. The demonstrations and protests continued, sometimes large at Fylingdales, sometimes large, sometimes small, but groups and individuals tried to keep the base and its role in the public and media eye. So moving on to Menwith Hill, just outside Harrogate in North Yorkshire, this plays a significant role in intelligence gathering and missile defence for the US. Menwith Hill intercepts all forms of electronic communication, including emails and phone calls. Each of the golf ball-like enclosures called radomes house a receiving dish that downloads data from satellites. The data has been intercepted from other communication satellites or ground-based transmitters. The base is run by the US National Security Agency, the NSA, which works closely with the UK's GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters. There's been a protest at Menwith Hill since the 1950s by different campaigning groups. The main campaigning groups have been Otley Peace Action Group from around 1951, the Campaign for the Accountability of American Bases, or CAB, established by Lindis Percy and Annie Rainbow, the Women's Peace Camps, established by Helen John, Anne Lee and others, 1992 to 1999, and the Menwith Hill Accountability Campaign, which more or less replaced CAB from around 2017. Supporting groups have included Yorkshire CND and the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, among others. Useful materials being produced by Yorkshire CND in 2012 and the Menwith Hill Accountability Campaign and Yorkshire CND in 2021. And the newsletters produced by the Menwith Hill Accountability Campaign provide the latest information on the base and related protests. The Otley Peace Action Group played a major role in raising public awareness and protests from the 1950s. Duncan Campbell exposed the phone tapping operation in 1980 and the echelon system of data collection from interception by satellites in 1988. Important information for these had been obtained from the base by peace campaigners, mainly women, and their vigilant observations. There have also been demonstrations, peace camps, non-violent blockades, trespass, questions in Parliament, letters to the press, and radio and TV coverage. Annual demonstrations on July the 4th, Independence from America Day, and during Keep Space for Peace Week, and weekly protests continue. A weekend peace camp was established by Otley Peace Action Group on the 29th of April in 1983. Others followed and eventually led to the setting up of a full-time peace camp in July 1984, which existed until 1987. The campers held numerous demonstrations and entered the base on many occasions, bringing out information from notice boards and in waste paper bins. In 1993, a monthly women-only peace camp was established in the northwest corner of the base near the main gate, and a second campsite was set up in January 1994 on the southeast corner. A full-time women's peace camp followed in May 1994. It was evicted, however, in April 1995, but the camp moved to the nearby Kettlesing lay-by. There were frequent arrests for fence cutting, entering the base, slogan painting, blockades, and for the visible protest that they maintained there. The camp grew to about 10 caravans, but court action reduced it to a part-time single information caravan in 1999, and eventually that too disappeared. In 1989, Bob Ward, the then Secretary of Yorkshire CND, devised a plan for invading the base by telephone. He'd gathered hundreds of numbers for phones inside the base from telephone directories, and these were distributed among campaigners who were to phone their number at a set time on April the 1st, 1989. In the meantime, messages and information were sent out that CND was planning to invade the base at that time. The police were there waiting on the day. Nobody showed up, but phones were ringing in the base and campaigners were expressing their concerns about the base to the people in the base directly. An actual invasion did occur in July 2001. Without notice, Greenpeace campaigners climbed over the fence and entered the base, some dressed as missiles. They climbed up water towers and aerials until arrested by police. There was a lot of media coverage and additional security was added to the main gate and surrounding fence. Demonstrations continued and CAB challenged the legality of the base and the bylaws that banned access to approaches outside the boundary fence. A number of court cases resulted in disclosures that the bylaws had not been imposed correctly. The CAB also monitored planning applications made by the MOD to Harrogate Council and learned that in 1997 Menwith Hill was to become a European relay ground station for the space-based infrared system, a space-based component of a US missile defense system, detecting missiles in outer space. 3 radomes on the south side of the base are being used for this purpose. Every year, a protest is held on the 4th of July, Independence from America Day, and a declaration calling for independence from the invasion of the US by its military bases is read out. The declaration was conceived by the Otley Peace Action Group in the 1980s. And Christine Dean, on the top left here, is shown reading it in year 2000. Unfortunately, Christine died not so long ago. She was a fantastic campaigner and always there with the opposition, the protests. Events were organised by CAB for many years with guided tours around the base and speeches from an amazing array of politicians and celebrities on this day, July the 4th, and these still go on. In recent years, the Menwith Hill Accountability Campaign has organised the events with speakers, information and entertainment. The declaration continues to be read out and a letter handed to the UK liaison officer, who usually comes out from the base to receive it. There have also been cycle rides from Leeds to Menwith Hill on July the 4th in 2004, another in 2016, and yet again in 2019. So maybe if everyone's up for it, we could do it again this year. Menwith Hill Accountability Campaign continue their presence at the base every Tuesday evening, rain or shine, from 6 to 7:30. Local groups and individuals join them in solidarity when they can. They've arranged with the police that every car exiting the base at that time will stop in order to see the placards and banners that are being displayed for a couple of, well, about half a minute or so, and then they are allowed to continue. I don't know of anywhere else in any protest where this actually happens. So space war and nuclear weapons are major threats to our survival and closely linked to climate change. Over the years, campaigners have challenged the morality and legality of these bases through the courts, through education, disclosures, and their physical presence. You probably don't need me to tell you that actions like these and much more are needed now more than ever. Thanks very much.
Perfect timing, Dave, just as I sent you a message. That's wonderful. Thank you. And we'll go straight over to Roy now. We're moving to another part of this island. And Roy, are you ready to offer us your presentation?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dave. There's some amazing history going on there. That's just so incredibly encouraging. All the things that you did. I mean, I'm going to focus. I was involved in the campaign in the 90s to stop a radar array being built on St David's Airfield, which is kind of like the twin of the Broady Airfield, which is the current proposed site for the Darc radar array. And you know, fortunately, we actually achieved a victory, which is quite rare in the peace activism world. There is a long history of protest there was an American military base, American Navy base at Broady, and there was a lot of peace protests really over the years in the same way. You know, there's a long tradition. That base has gone now, but the British Army have taken over from the RAF and currently occupy the site of Broady, which was you know, the land was kind of taken during the Second World War. I think six people lost their homes in order to grab the land. Anyway, so that was what happened in the 90s. Now the Americans, in conjunction with the MOD and the Australians, the AUKUS Pact group, have decided that they'd like to use the site of Broady Airfield to build a deep space advanced radar capability known as the acronym DARC, and it's literally about sort of a couple of 100 meters outside the boundary of the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, which is an area of, you know, exceptional beauty and it's very sensitive ecologically. So what I really wanted to do with this is all the technical aspects of, you know, what's going on in space have already been covered. So just to focus on what our current campaign has been getting up to since we kind of reformed to fight this new proposal. So we started off by building a website called parcagainstdarc.com, which was launched in May last year. And being as we're in Wales, it's a bilingual website with pages on health risks, tourism and the environment and security, as well as news articles, history and a lobbying page. And there's also linked to our online petition, a crowdfunder and a list of our supporters, like local businesses and other organisations like C&D Cymru. The website launch led to a TV mention on BBC Wales and S4C, which is the Welsh language TV channel, and as well as several positive news articles in the local press, thanks to Jim Scott. It's one of the team. So number two, we held then a public meeting in Solva Memorial Hall, which is very near to the site, on June the 27th, which was packed after local volunteers helped us flyer the local villages from Roach to Kruisgorch. At the meeting, we showed a video we made setting the tone for the event, as well as local speakers such as myself, Jim Scott, naturalist Michael Davis, and Emma Bowen, who's a manageress of a prominent local hotel group. We had CND Cymru's own Dylan Lewis Rowlands, as well as two video presentations on health via video from a radar expert in Israel called Dr. Michael Peleg, who talked about the health effects of the Iron Dome radar, and Professor Paul Heroux from McGill University in Canada, who also focused on the health effects of a very high intensity non-ionizing radiation. So the meeting was streamed live and later made available on YouTube. The event was a big success and was accompanied by a healthy amount of signatures on our petition and general awareness of what was being proposed by the US military in conjunction with the Australian and UK governments. Local papers shared the picture of the crowd holding up no radar signs and were mostly favourable to the campaign's point of view. So number three, we made a presentation to the Senedd Peace and Reconciliation Committee. The Senedd is the Welsh Parliament. Senedd members, Mabon ap Gwynfor, who happens to be the chairman of CND Cymru, Meredydd Hopwood, Heledd Vychan, and Jane Dodds. So that's four members of the Welsh Parliament were at this presentation that I made, via Zoom, and it at the end of my presentation, they said that they definitely wanted to support the campaign, and they commissioned some research by a Professor Colin McInnes of Academy Heddwch, which looked into various aspects of the Darc proposal and came up with a list of 12 questions which needed to be addressed by the MOD. We made a presentation also then to St David's City Council, which is St David's is the UK's smallest city, but it does have a cathedral, and the council, the city council, pledged their support for the campaign, and that led them to letting us put a banner outside the city hall that said "No radar, dim radar," which is no radar in Welsh. And so then the general election was announced on July the 4th, 2024, and we used that as an opportunity to sort of canvass all the potential candidates, and we had positive reactions from just about everybody, apart from the person who won, who was the Labour candidate, who just refused to comment on it. Even the incumbent Tory MP said that there should be a proper investigation into possible health risks. But the Labour guy who won, still to this day won't make any comments about the proposal at all. But just literally a stone throw above where the proposed site is another constituency now, which also has part of Cardiganshire and North Pembrokeshire, and the MP who got elected there, Ben Lake, he was definitely, he's a Plaid Cymru MP, and he, you know, he won, and he's definitely supporting the campaign. So you know, that was kind of, we made contacts during that time with lots of different political groups. Then in July, we got some new information leaflets made in both English and Welsh, and in time to go to the CND Cymru tent at the National Eisteddfod. You know, National Eisteddfod is a very important cultural event in Wales, which has been going on for you know, about 100 years or so, but bringing people from all over Wales together. I made a speech there in Welsh, although my Welsh is pretty rubbish, but I made a big effort to do that. And then on my birthday then, which was the 8th of August, we got the news that the MOD were going to hold 2 public events in Solva and St David's in September. And the news of this was accompanied by an article in The Guardian, which mentioned our campaign, but was largely supportive of this proposal. Well, you know, we debunked most of their arguments. We'd already had done on our website, but, you know, and on our Facebook page. But anyway, then we geared up for the events by delivering flyers, inviting local people to come and join the protests at the event. So meanwhile, the MOD produced their own flyers to announce their public engagement events, which was sent to homes in the St David's Peninsula. The flyers were thin on information and heavy on vague, flawed and long discredited claims, and unbelievably couldn't even get the place names of half the villages on the map right. Newgale became Newgate, Pennycombe became Pennycoon, and Middle Mill became Middle Hill. So that didn't inspire much confidence that in the local community. So we got 5 new roller banners made for our People's Exhibition to display outside the MOD events, covering all 5 of the major reasons why Darc was a complete disaster for our locality. When it came to the engagement events themselves, the MOD's attempts to ingratiate themselves and quiet the growing anger of local people by spouting lies and evidence-free denials, and so quiet the massively hostile media reception and huge petition of voices of rightly concerned locals, was an utter failure. Local people, with the help of Parc, took over the whole event weekend. The Friday began with a peace encampment setting up outside Cawdor Barracks with large anti-radar banners, which attracted media attention from BBC Wales. And those who attended the first event in Solva reported either not getting answers to questions or receiving different answers from different representatives. The People's Exhibition was marshalled by protesters with no radar banners who talked to people as they came out of the hall, including me and some of our friends from CND. That event, that evening, the 6:30 BBC Wales News broadcast a sum up of the day's events, and it was a bruising indictment of the MOD, with the 3-minute report giving excellent coverage to Parc, mentioning that its 15,000 signature petition at the top of the story, and speaking directly to residents who had started the peace camp outside the base. A not very convincing MOD commander talked about the ICNIRP guidelines for safety limits, which Parc's public meeting and website had already discredited. And the following day in St David's, when the MOD arrived, the first thing they would have seen would have been our Parc's no radar, dim radar banner mounted on the railings outside the hall, with the permission of St David's City Council, standing as a clear local community statement at the entrance to the building where their event was taking place. And this time we had 12 roller banners set up and many more protesters outside, which gave many people the impression that it was our event. Dozens of residents headed in armed with pressing and pertinent questions and received, as aptly reported by local paper, the Pembrokeshire Herald, nothing but dismissive or uncertain answers. Car horns could be heard blasting in solidarity, and chants of "We can stop Darc" rang out as hundreds of Parc's counter-disinformation leaflets were handed out to the public.
Roy,
Yeah.
we'd like to leave 5 minutes for some questions. So if you'd like to round up, there are some questions lined up.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. So, yeah, I've got quite a bit more than I had planned to say. But yeah, so basically, let me think, what can I leave out? We went to Plaid Cymru's conference and with the help of Jill Evans from C&D, we managed to get them to pass a resolution saying that they were going to support us. And following that, we were able to at C&D's AGM in November. We were there, and at the end of the meeting, the Mabon ap Gwynfor, who's the chairman of C&D Cymru, suggested we get someone to table a statement of opinion. We'd have to get one of our local MSs to do that, which we managed to do because Plaid had pledged their support. So we got Kevin Campbell to do that. And so that's actually gone through now in the Senedd, and we've got 10 Senedd members have supported that statement of opinion. It's similar to an early day motion in Parliament, but in the Welsh Parliament. So we produced 15,000 flyers, which we're hand delivering throughout the county at the moment, and we've had 3,020-page booklets which we've given to all the Senedd members, and we're holding an event at the Pierhead building in Cardiff on the 5th of March, which is being co-organised by lots of peace groups in Wales, and we get the best spot for all the MSs during lunch hour, so that I'm going to give a talk, and hopefully we can convince them to sign the statement of opinion. And we're also, just about ready to go forward with an EDM in Parliament, which will be proposed by Ben Lake, the Plaid MP for the next constituency. So that's basically what we've been up to. I did leave quite a bit out, but there we go.
That's amazingly fruitful, and both yourself and Dave, I mean, you've highlighted the great, enormous creativity that's there in the campaigning world, and also I think the deep longevity of campaigns that's come across very powerfully. We have some questions. I saw that Tom